Evidence from both twin and adoption studies was reviewed by Miles and Carey, 1997. They conducted a meta-analysis of 22 studies in which ratings of aggressive or antisocial behavior had been obtained either from the respondents themselves or, in the case of young children, from their parents. 2 further studies were included in which actual aggressive behavior had been observed. The authors concluded from their findings that shared genetic makeup plays a large role in similarities in self-ratings as well as parent ratings of aggressiveness, explaining up to 50% of the variance. Taking into account the different age groups included in the meta-analysis, they further suggest that the relative importance of genetic and environmental influences in shaping aggression may change in the course of development. Shared genes were found to be more powerful than shared environmental influences in explaining similarities in aggression in adulthood, whereas the reverse pattern was found for children and adolescents. However, an important qualification of these conclusions comes from the 2 studies that used behavioral observation as measures of aggression. In these studies, the impact of shared environment was substantially greater than that of genetic similarity. A later meta-analysis by Ree and Waldman, 2002, including 51 twin and adoption studies, also found substantial effects of genetic similarity, explaining 41% of the variance, but environmental influences were even stronger, accounting for 59%. Dilia and Gottsman, 1991, also found in their study of antisocial behavior that genetic similarity was more influential on questionnaire measures than on behavioral indicators, such as criminal convictions. At the same time, they concluded from their review of adoption studies that genetic factors and environmental factors may have an additive effect. Individuals whose biological as well as adoptive parents were criminal had the highest likelihood of becoming criminal themselves, followed by individuals whose biological parents, but not adoptive parents, had criminal records. The risk of the latter group becoming criminal was found by several studies to be substantially higher than that of the group whose adoptive parents were criminal, but whose biological parents were not, suggesting that genes are relatively more influential than shared environment. A meta-analysis by Burt, 2009, comparing physical aggression and rule-breaking as distinct aspects of antisocial behavior, concluded that genetic similarity played a greater role, and environmental factors played a lesser role in aggressive as compared with rule-breaking behavior. That genetic factors differ in the extent to which they can explain variability in aggressive behavior was also concluded in a recent review of twin studies, which found higher heritability for physical and proactive aggression than for reactive aggression. On balance, the available evidence suggests that genetic makeup must be regarded as an important source of individual variation in aggression. A precise assessment of the magnitude of its impact relative to environmental influences is difficult, hampered by various methodological problems that have been noted throughout the literature. For example, studies analyzing genetic versus environmental influences on criminality often failed to distinguish between violent and non-violent crimes. This distinction is crucial if the aim is to determine the heritability of aggressive behavior in particular, rather than antisocial or deviant behavior in general. Furthermore, studies combining both self-report and observation are needed to resolve the issue of why the 2 types of measures produce diverging evidence on the strength of genetic influences. With regard to the question of whether or not aggression is an inevitable part of human nature and individual character, research showing the impact of genetic factors has sometimes been construed as suggesting a deterministic, and thus pessimistic, view. If individuals carry the aggressive genes, they will grow up to be aggressive. However, such a view is rejected by behavioral geneticists. They stress that individuals' genetic makeup may predispose them towards becoming an aggressive person, but environmental factors play a crucial role in determining whether or not that predisposition will actually be expressed in aggressive behavior. As noted by Van Goosen et al. 2007, a genetic disposition towards aggressive behavior may become manifested in behavior in a negative family environment, or it may be suppressed in a positive environment. As children inherit the genetic disposition towards aggression from their parents, they are likely to grow up in a more aggression-prone family environment. To complicate matters further, children with a genetic disposition towards aggression may elicit negative responses from their social environment through their aggressive behavior, also pointing to the interactive influences of nature and nurture. The critical role of environmental factors is also demonstrated by evidence from the field of epigenetics. This research has shown that adverse experiences affecting individuals at sensitive periods of life, especially in prenatal development and early infancy, may trigger changes in the function of genes that lead to cognitive and emotional deficits involved in aggressive behavior. These findings show that genetic, inherited, and environmental, acquired, factors mutually influence each other, which may explain why individual differences in aggressive behavior are highly stable over time. We will return to the issue of stability in more detail in Chapter 4. Epigenetics, field of study showing that adverse experiences may change a person's genes related to aggressive behavior. Hormones and aggression. Another line of biological research on aggression is concerned with the role of hormonal and other physiological processes in explaining variations in aggressive behavior. Hormones. Higher levels of testosterone and lower levels of cortisol have been linked to aggression, but they need to be considered in combination with environmental influences. An obvious candidate for examination is the male sex hormone testosterone, both to account for individual differences among men and their aggressive tendencies, and to explain the widely demonstrated gender differences in physical aggression. See Chapter 4. Testosterone is related to the activation of fight impulses and the inhibition of flight or avoidance behavior, thereby increasing the likelihood of an aggressive response. A meta-analysis of 18 studies conducted by Archer et al. 1998 found that highly aggressive men had higher levels of testosterone than non-aggressive men. A later meta-analysis confirmed the significant association between testosterone and aggression in both men and women. However, the correlations are weaker than those found in animal studies. Rather than assuming a general link between testosterone and aggression, the challenge hypothesis argues that testosterone levels vary depending on whether they are adaptive from an evolutionary point of view. High testosterone levels are adaptive in relation to the challenge of sexual competition, i.e., selecting a mate and fighting off rivals, whereas low testosterone levels are adaptive in relation to the challenge of parental investment, i.e., forming relationships and caring for offspring. This pattern is proposed to hold for both men and women. With regard to situational variations in testosterone levels, Kleinsmith et al. 2006 conducted an interesting experimental study. They asked male participants to handle a gun or a children's toy for 15 minutes and measured testosterone levels before and after. Men who had handled the gun showed a significant increase in testosterone levels, whereas those who had handled the toy did not. Those who had handled the gun also showed more aggressive behavior in a subsequent phase, as measured by the hot sauce paradigm, see Chapter 1, and this effect could be at least partly explained by the increase in testosterone levels. Studying fluctuating testosterone levels in women, a recent study found that reactive aggression was higher when testosterone levels were also high. Cortisol has been examined as another hormonal correlate of aggression, as it is related to the experience and management of stress. Low cortisol levels have been linked to fearlessness, risk-taking, and insensitivity to punishment. Longitudinal studies have shown that low levels of resting cortisol in boys predict aggressive behavior over time. Psychological underreactivity, as indicated by low cortisol levels, seems to be a characteristic feature of aggressive and antisocial behavior due to its disinhibiting function. By way of explanation, it has been argued that individuals with low levels of cortisol are less susceptible to fear of punishment, which would prevent them from engaging in aggressive behavior. Building on the two strands of research, the dual hormone hypothesis proposes that it is the combination of high testosterone and low cortisol levels, i.e., a high testosterone-cortisol ratio, that predicts high levels of aggression. In this combination, the aggression-stimulating effect of high testosterone levels is not counterbalanced by the inhibitory effect of cortisol, resulting in unmitigated aggressive behavior. While the dual hormone hypothesis has received support for men, evidence for women has been inconclusive so far. In addition to testosterone and cortisol, other hormones, such as higher oxytocin and lower serotonin, have been discussed as correlates of aggression, along with other biological processes such as low resting heart rate and increased heart rate variability. Although a detailed discussion is beyond the scope of this chapter, these are promising lines of research for a better understanding of the biological basis of aggressive behavior. Dual hormone hypothesis postulates that it is the combination of high testosterone and low cortisol that promotes aggressive behavior. Although the research discussed in this section shows that dispositional and situational differences in testosterone and cortisol may be related to aggressive behavior, it is clear that hormones do not shape aggressive behavior in a deterministic fashion. They work together with a wide range of factors in the social environment that may reinforce or attenuate the impact of biological influences on aggression. Psychological explanations. The theoretical approaches considered so far have referred to biological processes in explaining aggression. We shall now turn to contributions that focus on the psychological mechanisms involved in aggressive behavior. It is worth noting, though, that the earliest line of theoretical development in this tradition, namely Freud's psychoanalytic account of aggression, also started off from a biological construct by conceptualizing aggressive behavior as the expression of a genetically rooted instinct. Freudian psychoanalysis, aggression as a destructive instinct. In Freud's dual instinct theory, Freud, 1920, proposed that individual behavior is driven by two basic forces that are part and parcel of human nature: the life instinct, eros, and the death instinct, thanatos. Whereas eros drives the person towards pleasure-seeking and wish fulfillment, thanatos is directed at self-destruction. Due to their antagonistic nature, the two instincts are a source of sustained intrapsychic conflict that can be resolved by diverting the destructive force away from the individual and onto others. Thus, acting aggressively towards another person is seen as a mechanism for releasing destructive energy in a way that protects the intrapsychic stability of the actor. In his notion of catharsis, Freud acknowledged the possibility of releasing destructive energy through non-aggressive, expressive behavior, e.g., sarcastic jokes, but with only temporary effects. According to this view, aggression is an inevitable feature of human behavior beyond the control of the individual. It is interesting to note that Freud revised his earlier model, focusing on eros only, and added a destructive force after witnessing the violence of World War I. Empirical evidence in support of Freud's theorizing is scarce and largely based on case studies, without the stringent operationalizations required in modern-day quantitative studies. Nonetheless, his ideas have played a significant role in promoting the understanding of aggression, insofar as they inspired the influential frustration-aggression hypothesis, which will be considered next. The frustration-aggression hypothesis and the role of aggressive cues. Instinct-related explanations of aggression have met with a critical reception, not least because of a shortage of empirical evidence to support them. However, the idea that there is a force within the organism which, in conjunction with external events, leads to aggressive behavior has been central to an influential line of research that postulated an aggressive drive as motivating aggressive behavior. Unlike an instinct, a drive is not an ever-present, continuously increasing source of energy, but is activated only if the organism finds itself deprived of the means of satisfying a vital need. A drive, then, serves as a goal-directed, energizing force directed at terminating a state of deprivation. Frustration-aggression hypothesis assumes that frustration, that is, blockage of a goal-directed activity, increases the likelihood of aggressive behavior. Aggressive cues, situational cues with an aggressive meaning that increase the accessibility of aggressive cognitions. In the frustration-aggression hypothesis, aggression is seen as triggered by frustration. Frustration is defined as an external interference with the goal-directed behavior of the person. The experience of frustration activates the desire to restore the path to goal attainment, and aggressive behavior results from the drive to remove the source of the interference. For example, in the field experiment by Harris, 1974, discussed in Chapter 1, a person waiting in a queue is pursuing a goal-directed activity, such as buying a train ticket at a busy ticket office. If someone else jumps the queue and cuts in just in front, the person's goal-directed activity is blocked, i.e. frustrated. This releases aggressive energy to restore the goal-directed activity, e.g. by pushing the person aside. In the first version of the frustration-aggression hypothesis, Dollard et al., 1939, assumed that frustration would always trigger aggression, and that aggression would always be attributable to a preceding frustration. However, it quickly became clear that not every frustration leads to an aggressive response. Alternatively, frustrated individuals may withdraw from the situation or become upset rather than angry. Moreover, not every aggressive act is the result of a preceding frustration. Acts of instrumental aggression carried out to achieve a particular goal, such as robbing a bank to resolve a desperate financial situation, do not necessarily entail a previous frustration. Therefore, the earlier assumption of a deterministic relationship between frustration and aggression was changed into a probabilistic version by N.E. Miller, 1941, one of the authors of the original theory. He stated that frustration produces instigations to a number of different types of response, one of which is an instigation to some form of aggression. In this revised view, aggression is not the only, but merely one possible response to frustration. To the extent that the aggressive act reduces the strength of the underlying drive, it becomes self-reinforcing. There is an increasing likelihood that an aggressive response will be shown following subsequent frustrations. Displaced aggression. Whether or not frustration will result in an aggressive response depends on the influence of moderating variables. Fear of punishment for overt aggression or unavailability of the frustrator are factors that may inhibit aggression following a frustration. These moderators also explain why aggression may be displaced away from the frustrator onto a more easily accessible or less intimidating target. The concept of displaced aggression plays a role in understanding aggression not only in response to frustration, but particularly in response to provocation. Frustration and provocation are related, but distinguishable constructs. Whereas frustration focuses on goal blockage, provocation refers to an interpersonal encounter. However, the two concepts converge, for example, when the provocation takes the form of exposing another person to frustrating events, such as insoluble tasks or failure in a competition. Therefore, research on displaced aggression after a provocation is also relevant to understanding the frustration-aggression link. Displaced aggression. Tendency to react to frustration with an aggressive response directed not at the original source of the frustration, but at an unrelated, more easily accessible target. Provocation. Anger eliciting interpersonal encounter. A meta-analysis of 40 studies by Marcus Newell et al. 2000 found consistent evidence for the displacement of aggression from the source of the frustration or provocation onto a less powerful or more accessible target. Subsequent research into triggered displaced aggression has provided further insights into the psychological processes involved in the path from frustration or provocation to aggression. Trigger displaced aggression describes the outcome of a sequence of events which starts with the experience of a frustration or provocation that activates the desire to retaliate. If this desire cannot be acted out, a relatively mild subsequent provocation, the trigger, may elicit a disproportionately strong aggressive response. For example, a man who is told off at work by his boss, against whom he cannot retaliate because the boss is too powerful, may react with an outburst of verbal abuse in response to a mildly teasing comment from his wife when he gets home. The same comment might have been dismissed as a joke in the absence of the prior provocation. Experimental research has shown that participants who were first exposed to a provocation without being able to retaliate and then encountered a mildly provoking trigger showed much stronger aggressive responses than participants who were exposed to the same trigger without being previously provoked. To explain displaced triggered aggression, two processes have been proposed. The first is the elicitation of negative arousal by the initial provocation that is still present when the trigger is encountered and is intensified by the trigger. The second process refers to rumination about the initial provocation that is maintained because the person is unable to deliver an aggressive response to the source of the frustration. The anger elicited by the original provocation is kept on the back burner and is caused to flare up again by the trigger. As both arousal and rumination subside over time, triggered displaced aggression is likely to occur primarily when the trigger is encountered shortly after the initial provocation. However, Miller et al. 2003 discussed a number of situational and personal variables that may lead to displaced triggered aggression even over extended periods of time, such as the importance of the goal that is impeded or the dispositional tendency to engage in ruminative thinking. For a discussion of research on rumination and aggression, see Chapter 4. A recent series of studies has shown that displaced aggression may serve an instrumental function as a means to restore a sense of competence after a goal-directed action has been blocked by a frustration, and may be reduced if the person can restore competence and self-efficacy by other non-aggressive behaviors.